The galaxy had never seen anything like it. Not the fall of the Keth Dominion, not the siege of Voron Prime, not the silent extinguishing of the Luminary Convergence 3,000 years before recorded memory. Those were catastrophes of scale, of numbers, of fleet tonnage, and star-killing yields. This was something else, something that the Galactic Conclave's most decorated xenobiologists would spend decades arguing about in hushed, embarrassed voices, because they had looked at humanity's genetic map and seen cattle, and they had been very wrong. It started with a quarantine, the research outpost on Calder 9, a frozen, methane-skinned rock orbiting a red dwarf at the edge of the contested meridian, had gone silent on day 412 of the Vale Compact's joint species. Archaeological survey, no distress beacon, no final transmission, just silence and then the slow, terrible blinking of a proximity alarm as the outpost automated systems registered something moving through its corridors that hadn't been there before. The Conclave's Rapid Containment Wing had dispatched a Vale security team first. Standard protocol. The Vale were 9 feet of gray chitinous armor, natural empaths, bred across 6,000 years of warrior culture. They were considered the galaxy's finest close-quarters combatants. 7 of them went in. None of them came out. That was when someone, reluctantly, unhappily, and with the kind of bureaucratic foot-dragging that only a 12-species governing body can achieve, filed a request for human military assistance. Form 7 Gamma, subsection C, the one almost no one ever filed, because it required the filing party to formally acknowledge that human soldiers might be better suited to a given situation than any conclave species, which was politically the equivalent of admitting the universe was older than your religion claimed. The request landed on the desk of Conclave Liaison Officer Yuratel Vassi, a Vale administrator of middle rank and extraordinary patience, who read it twice, set it down, and said to the empty room, "Ancestors forgive me," before stamping it approved. She had never met a human soldier before. She was about to meet 8 of them. Sergeant Major Kale Reaper Marin was 34 years old, which by human reckoning was considered young for a senior non-commissioned officer. By Vale reckoning, he was practically a child. The Vale reached full cognitive maturity at 60 and didn't consider anything under 40 worth listening to. This was, as Reaper had once explained to a Vale checkpoint officer who'd tried to wave him through an inspection queue, a failure of imagination on your part. He had a face that looked like it had argued with geology and mostly lost, a jaw like poured concrete, a nose that had been broken and set wrong twice, a scar along his left cheekbone from a Tyrak splinter round that had grazed him during the outpost. Fenris evacuation. His eyes were the color of deep water, still and measuring. He moved the way certain large animals moved, not hurrying, but covering ground anyway, like the concept of urgency had been built into his skeleton and didn't need to announce itself. He was reading the mission briefing on his wrist screen when the Conclave shuttle docked with the UNDF carrier Meridian's hand, and he was still reading it when his boots hit the hangar deck, because the briefing was 47 pages long, and whoever had written it had clearly been paid by the word. Behind him came his team. There was Corporal Dessa Torch Halvari, who was 26, and had arms like bridge cables and a talent for explosives that bordered on the artistic. She was chewing something. She was always chewing something, and she had a way of looking at structural walls that made engineers nervous, like she was already imagining what it would look like with a hole in it. There was Specialist Oren Ghost Selby, the team's reconnaissance lead, slight and quiet in the way that certain very dangerous things were quiet. The way a pressure mine was quiet, or the way a deep-sea predator was quiet just before it rose. He had completed 3 solo infiltration missions into active combat zones. He had not been detected on any of them. He found this professionally satisfying and personally insufficient. He was always looking for something harder. There was PFC Rima Stitches Adari, the team's field medic, who was 22 and had done 2 tours on the periphery and had the kind of competence that didn't perform itself. She just did things. Injuries stopped happening or got fixed, and she moved on to the next problem. There was Lance Corporal Tomas Brick Varga, massive and slow-spoken, who had been offered officer training twice and had declined both times on the grounds that he found paperwork philosophically objectionable. He carried the team's heavy support weapon the way most people carried a light jacket, as though it were slightly inconvenient rather than technically crew-served. There was Specialist Enid Wren Calloway, the team's signals and tech specialist, who spoke to machines the way other people spoke to pets and got approximately the same results: unexpected loyalty and occasional biting. There was PFC David Smoke Oren, who was 19 and on his first off-world deployment and was trying very hard not to let it show, and mostly succeeding, except when he thought no one was looking. And there was Lieutenant Cass Marin, Reaper's younger sister by 3 years, Dr. Cass Marin, xenobiologist and research liaison, attached to the team not because she was military, but because she had been part of the Caldor 9 survey team for 7 months before the quarantine. And she had 14 people in that outpost she considered friends, and she had not asked permission to come. She had simply appeared at the staging point with her gear packed and her credentials in hand and a look on, her face that said she had already considered every argument against her presence and found all of them insufficient. Reaper had looked at her for a long time when she'd shown up. Then he had said, "Stay behind me," and she had said, "When have I ever?" And he had turned away before she could see his expression, because it was not the expression of someone who was going to win that argument, and he knew it. Yira Telvasi met them in the hangar bay. She was 9 feet tall, her chitin a pale silver gray that indicated high administrative rank, and she regarded the 8 humans with the careful, controlled expression of someone who had been briefed extensively on a subject and was now confronting the reality of it. "Sergeant Major Marin," she said. Her translator rendered it in clipped, precise standard. "I am Liaison Officer Telvasi. I will be accompanying your team to Caldor 9. Reaper looked up at her. She was more than a foot taller than him. She weighed, he estimated, somewhere north of 400 pounds in Veil combat carapace. She had defeated 43 opponents in formal challenge combat over the course of her military career. Before transitioning to administration, she radiated, even through the bureaucratic veneer, a quality that most species would recognize as extreme capability held at rest. "Understood," Reaper said. "What can you tell me about what happened to your team?" Telvasi was quiet for a moment. They entered the outpost. Their biomonitors recorded elevated cortisol and adrenaline analogs consistent with engagement-level threat response. Then the biomonitors stopped transmitting, all of them at once, within 4 seconds of each other. Reaper nodded slowly. "Corridor engagement," he said. "Something hit them fast and close. That is our assessment." "You said 7 Veil warriors, yes, and they were your best." Telvasi's mandibles pressed flat against her face, which Reaper had been briefed was a veil expression of something between professional pride and grief. "They were." Reaper looked back at his team. Torch was examining the briefing images of the outpost layout on a portable display. Ghost had his eyes closed, which meant he was memorizing the schematics he'd uploaded to his neural assist earlier. Stitches was checking her medical kit with the quiet, thorough efficiency of someone who had learned the hard way what ran out first. Brick was watching the Veil liaison with the patient, benign expression of a large, friendly dog who was also considering whether a fence could be jumped. "We'll get your people out if there's anyone left to get out," Reaper said, "and we'll shut down whatever's in there." Telvasi looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that Reaper couldn't quite read. Not doubt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something evaluative. "The Veil Conclave has been monitoring human military capability for 11 years, she said carefully. "Your species' physical parameters are below average for Conclave military standards. Your average soldier masses considerably less than a Veil warrior. Your skeletal structure is comparatively fragile. Your sensory range is limited. You have no natural armor. You do not benefit from the empathic field sharing that Veil warriors use for coordination." "No," Reaper agreed, "and yet the request was filed. Because your people went in and didn't come back." Another pause. "Yes." Reaper picked up his weapon, a Undif pattern pulse carbine, heavily modified, with a secondary mount for the plasma torch attachment Torch had built him after the Fenris engagement. He checked the charge, checked the action, slung it. "That happens sometimes," he said, not unkindly. "We'll take it from here." The Arc, the Conclave equivalent, a fold transit relay called a shear gate, deposited them inside Caldor 9's research outpost at 04 in standard time, and the first thing Reaper noticed was the smell. He'd done enough bad rooms in his career to have a taxonomy for smells. There were the smells of long abandoned places, dust and old air, and the faint chemical ghost of whatever had been stored there. There were the smells of active combat, acrid and chemical and organic in ways that didn't bear cataloging. There were the smells of aftermath, which were the worst. This was something else. "Something biological," Wren said quietly, her scanner already moving. "Organic compound signatures." Not decomposition exactly, more like metabolic byproduct, something alive. Something that eats? Smoke asked. Something that processes? Wren said, which was not a more reassuring answer. The outpost was a medium-sized research facility, 22 rooms across 3 levels, designed for a mixed-species crew of about 90, with lab space, habitat zones, a central communications hub, and a deep excavation shaft that descended nearly 800 meters into Kaldar 9's crust toward the archaeological dig site that had been the point of the whole operation. The lights were on emergency minimum, a dim, reddish glow that made everything look either warm or ominous depending on your disposition. "Contact markers," Ghost said softly. He was pointing at the floor. Reaper looked down. The corridor floor was a composite material designed to be easy to clean. It was not currently clean. There were marks across it, not footprints exactly, but impact patterns. Something heavy had moved through here more than once in a way that dragged rather than stepped. "7 Vale," Telvasi said behind them. Her voice was very controlled. "Those are not their boot signatures." "No," Reaper agreed. Something else walked over them. He didn't say what the dark smears under the drag marks probably were. Telvasi was not naive and did not need it said. "Formation," Reaper said quietly. Ghost forward, Brick on the heavy weapon, Torch watching their 6, Wren scanning, Stitches central, Cass behind Stitches. Smoke on Reaper's left shoulder. "I don't need," Cass began. "You stay with Stitches," Reaper said, non-negotiable. She made a sound that indicated she was filing this under protest but complying for now. They moved through the first corridor in a silence that was not absence of sound, but deliberate management of it. Reaper had spent a long time learning the difference. Silence as tactical choice, not as default. Every footfall considered, every breath measured. Ghost moved like smoke through a crack. Brick moved like a glacier, huge and quiet and inexorable. The first room was a lab. It had been a lab. The equipment was still there, most of it, though some of it had been thrown with what must have been considerable force. Centrifugation units, overturned, sample cases shattered, analysis terminals face down on the floor as though they'd been slapped by something enormous. There were biological traces everywhere that Wren's scanner categorized quietly, as consistent with multiple organisms. "Not just Vale genetic material," Wren murmured. "Other species." The survey team was multi-species. 22 researchers, Cass said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Vale Keth 2 Luminari, and 9 humans." Cass's colleagues. The people she'd spent 7 months with in a pressurized box at the edge of inhabited space, eating bad ration food and arguing about taxonomy, and sharing a terrible communal entertainment library, and learning which of each other's habits were endearing and which were genuinely insufferable, and accumulating the particular intimacy of people who had no one else to be close to. Reaper looked at his sister for just a moment, and it was the look that said he's understood, and that understanding didn't make it easier, but it was what he had to offer. Then he moved on. The second corridor was where they found the first body. It was Vale, or it had been. Even Telvasi, who had seen Vale casualties before, was quiet for a long time. Stitches crouched next to it and ran her scanner with the careful, professional focus of someone who had made a deliberate decision not to process the visual input emotionally until there was time. "Multiple penetrating wounds," she said. "Pattern is consistent with clawed or taloned appendages. Significant force. The carapace was breached." She looked up. Whatever did this was strong enough to punch through Vale combat armor. Telvasi made a sound that didn't translate, low, resonant, something in the subvocal range that Reaper felt more than heard. Grief, maybe. Or the Vale equivalent of bracing. "It ambushed them," Ghost said from further down the corridor. He was crouched at an intersection reading the floor. "They were moving in formation. You can see the dispersal pattern here. They started to spread for a contact on the left, and then something came from above." He looked up. There was an access panel in the ceiling, the kind used for maintenance conduit. It had been removed. From the inside, they never got the formation set. "How fast?" Reaper asked. Ghost considered. "Given the wound distribution, the biomonitor cutoff timing, 4 seconds for 7 warriors." He stood up. "Very fast." Reaper looked at the ceiling, the access panel. Whatever had opened it from the inside had known the ceiling was there, had known what the Vale formation would look like, had positioned itself accordingly. It was thinking. "It learns," he said quietly. "What?" Telvasi asked. "Whatever's in here. It watched your team come in. It studied their approach, figured out their formation, found the optimal position to take them all out before they could adapt." He looked at Ghost. "Am I reading that right?" Ghost nodded. "That's my read." Reaper turned to tell Vasi. That's why 7 of your best didn't make it back. It wasn't strength. It was information. Tel Vasi was quiet for a moment that felt weighted. Your species, she said carefully. How do you typically respond to opponents who use tactical intelligence of that order? Reaper picked up his weapon. We stop giving them new information and start giving them new problems. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at every ceiling from that point forward. They found the second body in the habitat section. Another veil, this one in a dormitory alcove, which meant it had retreated before being caught, which was behavior Tel Vasi described, in a very quiet voice, as completely inconsistent with Veil Warrior psychology under any circumstance she had ever observed. Veil Warriors did not retreat. They redirected, flanked, feinted, but they did not run. It scared them, Torch said flatly. Veil do not experience fear in that they ran, Torch said. Not unkindly. Just precisely. Whatever was in there scared 7 of your best warriors into running, and it killed them while they were running, which is the worst time to get caught. She looked at Reaper. We need to find out what we're dealing with before it finds out we're here. Ghost, Reaper said, already on it. Ghost had pulled a set of microsensors from his kit, flat, magnetic, no larger than a fingernail, the kind that could be stuck to any surface and would transmit passively for 6 hours. He had 14 of them. He was mapping them against the outpost schematics. I'll seed the corridor network. 40-minute sweep should give us a movement map. We don't have 40 minutes, Smoke said. We have what we take, Ghost said, and went to work. They pulled back to a defensible position, a storage room with 1 entrance, solid composite walls, no ceiling access, and waited. This was the part that most people misunderstood about military operation. It was not primarily about action. It was primarily about information, patience, and the disciplined management of fear. Smoke was not managing his fear very well. He was doing all the right things, keeping his weapon ready, watching his sector, staying quiet. But there was a quality to his breathing that Reaper recognized, the shallow, slightly too controlled breathing of a young soldier who had not yet learned to make fear a tool, rather than a weather pattern. Reaper moved next to him, didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there. First time in a hot zone? Reaper asked, very quietly. No, Sergeant Major. I was on the periphery for first time it's been this specific kind of hot. A pause. Yeah, that's good, Reaper said. Smoke looked at him. That's good? Means your threat assessment is accurate. This is specifically bad in a way that most situations aren't. Being scared of it appropriately means you're reading the room correctly. He looked at the boy, kid 19 years old, someone's son, and said, fear is fine. Fear means your body is paying attention. Just don't let it make your decisions. That's your job, not its job. Smoke breathed, steadied, understood, good.
It's your sector.
Tel Vasi had been watching this exchange. When Smoke turned away, she said very quietly, to Reaper, the Veil method is suppression. We train our warriors to eliminate the fear response entirely. And they ran anyway, Reaper said, not cruelly. And they ran anyway, she agreed, and there was something in her voice that sounded like the beginning of a recalibration. The slow, uncomfortable process of updating a very old model. Ghost came back at the 30-minute mark with data, 3 targets. Moving in the eastern section of the facility, at the level that connected to the excavation shaft. Moving in a pattern that was not random, it was systematic, a slow sweep of the eastern corridors, the kind of movement pattern that would eventually cover the entire facility. They were searching. 3, Brick said, not 1. 3 confirmed, Ghost said. Could be more below, Size, Torch asked. Ghost pulled up a sensor image. The thermal signature was large, roughly 2 meters tall, massively broad, with a heat profile that didn't match any registered species in the Conclave database. 6 limbs confirmed, articulated tail. Cranial structure suggested large processing capacity. What does the database say? Cass asked. Wren had been running it against every known species catalog the Undef carried. Nothing, no match. It's not in any of our records or Conclave records. Something from the Diggs site, Cass said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very focused. The scientist surfacing, the way it always did when she found something genuinely unknown. Even now, even here. The excavation went down 800 meters. Whatever those archaeologists found down there, they woke something up, Reaper said, or opened something. A sealed chamber. A hibernation structure. She was thinking fast, running it in real time the way she always had. This was the quality Reaper had always admired. About his sister, the way her brain moved when it had something real to grip. If this is pre-conclave, there may be no data on it anywhere. It could have been down there for millennia. That's interesting information, Reaper said. Here's the part that matters right now. There are 3 of them, they're searching for us, and we have people to find. The survivors, if any, are most likely in the deep-level storage sections, Wren said, pulling up the schematics. Heaviest blast shielding, designed for emergency refuge. If any of the researchers had time to reach it. Can you access the internal communication system? Reaper asked her. Possibly. It's hardwired. If I can get to a junction point without being detected. Ghost. Ghost and Wren exchanged a look. She held up 3 fingers, the time she needed in minutes. He considered it. 2. She made a face. 2.5. Done. They moved in the 10-minute window when Ghost's sensors showed all 3 targets on the facility's western side, moving away. Ghost and Wren went first, low and fast, down the Eastern Service corridor, while Reaper, Brick, and Torch held a covering position at the junction, and Telvasi watched their rear with a Veil combat blade that was roughly the length of Smoke's entire arm. Wren found the junction box. Ghost watched the corridor. She worked in 90 seconds, which Reaper logged for future reference as evidence that deadline pressure was excellent for productivity. Internal comms are up, she whispered, broadcasting on the emergency band. Reaper leaned in. This is UNDEF search and rescue. If anyone is sheltering in this facility, respond on this channel. You are not alone. Silence for 3 seconds. Then, oh thank God, a voice, human, female, hoarse from what sounded like several days of not speaking above a whisper. Oh thank God. This is Dr. Petra Volna, Xenobotany. I have 6 people with me. We're in sublevels 3 and 4, emergency storage. There are things in here they've been. I know, Reaper said. We're coming. How many of you are mobile? 4 mobile, 2 injured. 1 critical. We're coming. Keep this channel open. Who's we? UNF. Marines. A pause. They sent humans. Another pause, smaller. They actually sent humans. Her tone was not quite what Reaper had expected from someone whose life was apparently at stake. It was not relief exactly. It was more like someone who had been told by a doctor that the condition was treatable. The surgery was going to be difficult and uncomfortable. But the odds were actually quite good. A specific kind of complicated, effortful hope. Sit tight, Reaper said. We're moving. What came next was 30 minutes that Reaper would later describe, in the official incident report, as a complex tactical navigation of a hostile environment under continuous contact pressure with non-registered indigenous threat organisms. In the informal version he told his sister afterward, over 2 drinks in the carrier mess, he called it the part where everything tried to go wrong at once and mostly didn't. The first contact came 3 minutes into the descent toward the sublevels. Smoke saw it first. He was watching his sector properly, fear converted to function, and what he saw was shadow moving wrong at the far end of a corridor. Not the shadow of environmental movement, but the shadow of something deliberately trying to look like nothing. Contact, he said, no louder than necessary. Far end, it's watching us. They all stopped. For a long, still moment, nothing happened. The corridor stretched ahead, 70 meters of it. Dim red emergency lighting casting shadows that cut at angles. Something at the far end that wasn't quite visible. Not because it was hidden, but because it was very good at being where the light wasn't. Then it stepped out. The briefings had been wrong. The thermal imaging had captured the size but not the texture. The quality of the thing that was now standing at the end of the corridor looking at them was not primarily about its dimensions. It was about the way it moved. Like every joint worked independently. Like locomotion had been an engineering problem it had solved multiple times and kept the best solutions. 6 limbs, yes. 4 for locomotion, 2 that functioned as something between arms and weapons, ending in appendages that curved like surgical instruments. Head like an elongated wedge, set with sensory structures that weren't eyes exactly, but tracked with the directional focus of eyes. It had the posture of something that had never been prey, and it was, Reaper noted, absolutely still, looking at them, taking its time. It's measuring us, Ghost said quietly. Yeah, Reaper agreed. It had done this with the Veil team, presumably. Filed information. Planned accordingly. It had had the information it needed on Veil physiology, Veil formations, Veil tactical responses. That information had been useful to it. What it did not have was information on humans, and right now it was trying to get some. Don't give it the read, Reaper said low to his team. Formation shift, Brick left, Torch right, standard disperse. Move like you've done this 10,000 times. They moved, smooth, practiced, unhurried. Not the Veil response, not the warrior's formal expansion, the broadcast aggression, just repositioning. Like it was routine, like whatever was at the end of that corridor was a variable that had already been accounted for and filed under manageable. The thing at the end of the corridor tilted its head. Reaper had seen that behavior before, in footage of Earth's large predators. The moment when the animal registered something it hadn't fully modeled. The pause before adaptation. "It doesn't know what to do with us yet," Cass said from behind him, and she was absolutely right, and absolutely calm about it, in the particular way that scientists were calm about things they found genuinely fascinating. "That's our window," Reaper said. "Brick." Brick fired. The heavy support weapon, a UNDEF pattern plasma repeater, drum-fed, designed for suppression of fortified positions, was not subtle. It filled the corridor with directed energy in a sustained burst that painted the far end in light. The thing moved. Reaper gave it credit. It moved very fast. But the corridor was 70 meters and it was large and Brick was very good. And it took 2 hits before it cleared the intersection. "Moving," Reaper said, and they moved. The descent to sublevels 3 and 4 took 11 minutes of controlled movement through 3 more contacts, 2 more sightings, where the things pulled back, and 1 engagement in a junction room where Torch's explosive attachment earned its keep, and Ghost confirmed no pursuit from behind. Stitch's patched Smoke's left arm where a piece of shrapnel had caught him. 4 minutes, 2 bioseal patches, done. Smoke continued without comment. Telvasi moved through it all with them. She was, Reaper noted, adapting. The first contact had visibly shaken her. Not in the way that fear shook someone, but in the way that a fundamental recalibration shook someone. When the model you'd built of a situation turned out to be inadequate. She watched how the human team moved. She started mirroring it, the dispersion, the deliberate unhurriedness, the way they managed information rather than reacting to stimuli. She was, Reaper realized, very good. Underneath the administrative rank and the veil warrior pride, she was a genuinely good operator who had simply been working with incomplete data. The blast door to sublevel storage was sealed from the inside, with a manual lock that required a biological key from an authorized crew member. Reaper got on the comms. "Dr. Volna, we're at your door." The lock cycled. The door opened 12 centimeters and 1 human eye looked through the gap at the assembled fire team and the 9-foot Vael liaison, and then Dr. Petra Volna, who was approximately 5'4", dusty, sleep-deprived, and carrying a wrench she'd apparently decided was better than nothing, opened the door the rest of the way and said, "You brought a Vael." "She brought us," Reaper said. Volna looked at Telvasi. Telvasi looked at Volna. Something passed between them that was not words. "Thank you," Volna said. "Thank them," Telvasi said, with a directness that cost her something. "They are the ones who got you here." Behind Volna were 6 researchers, 1 Keth, 2 Vael, alive, which had clearly surprised Telvasi, and 3 humans, 1 of whom was being carried, and 2 of whom were walking with the careful, effortful movement of people conserving energy and pain medication. There was also a 7th, whom Reaper had not expected. He was human, late 50s, white-haired, with the dazed, hollowed quality of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 72 hours and was now out of it and running on nothing. He introduced himself as Dr. Avril Haas, lead archaeologist, and he had something in his eyes that Reaper recognized as the specific haunting of a man who had opened a door he could not close. "The dig site," he said. "We found the chamber 14 days ago. We thought it was a sealed environmental pocket. Calder 9 is geologically stable, and the spectroscopy suggested it was an artifact vault. Luminary period, possibly pre-luminary." He was talking, not panicked but compressed, like someone who had been living with information that had nowhere to go for 3 days. "We opened it. There was a hibernation architecture inside, organic, grown rather than built. Nothing like anything in the catalog. We didn't understand what it was until the seals broke."
"How many?"
Reaper asked. Haas looked at him. "We counted 7 chambers." Brick, very quietly, said something in a language Reaper didn't speak but understood the emotional content of perfectly. 7 chambers. 3 targets on sensor," Ghost said. 4 unaccounted. "Below," Haas said. "They went back to the lower levels after the first day. We heard them through the rock." Reaper processed this. 7 creatures, potentially thousands of years old, awakened, loose in a research station, now on 2 different levels of a facility that connected to a shear gate to the broader conclave transit network. If any of them reached the gate, he looked at Telvasi. She had reached the same conclusion. Her expression was very controlled and her mandibles were pressed very flat, and she said, "The gate must not be reached." Agreed. Reaper looked at his team. New objective. We get the survivors out, we seal the gate, we contain the lower levels. That's 3 objectives and we're 8 people, Torch said. 7, Smoke said, holding up his wrapped arm with a slight wince. You're still people, Stitches said firmly. The sheargate control panel is in the upper-level communications hub, Wren said, already checking her schematics. I can seal and encrypt it from there. Anyone trying to use it without the encryption key would need to physically destroy it, which would also destroy its functionality. How long to get there? From here, given what's between us? Wren looked at Ghost. He held up 7 fingers. She nodded. 7 minutes if we move well. We'll move well, Reaper said. Haas, can you bring us back to the dig site? Haas stared at him. You want to go down? We need to know what we're sealing in, and we need to know if there's a way to get these things back in their chambers. They don't want to go back, I know, but Dr. Marin, he nodded at his sister, is a xenobiologist. If there's biological or chemical data in that chamber that tells us something about how they hibernate, how they're triggered, we use it. If not, we seal the levels and figure it out later with a bigger team. Cass was already nodding. She had her scanner out. She had the specific focus in her eyes that she'd had their whole lives. The same look she'd worn at 8 years old, examining a dead bird in the garden with a stick. Not callous, just genuinely, urgently interested in how things worked. I can work fast, she said. You always could, Reaper said, and there was something in it that wasn't just the comment it appeared to be. They split the team. Ghost took Volna and the survivors toward the sheargate hub, with Stitches managing the 2 wounded and smoke-running rear guard. Reaper watched him go and thought the kid was going to be all right. He was going to be exactly all right. Telvasi went with them, both because she was their most capable combatant and because she would not let 2 living Veil warriors walk out of a hostile facility without Veil escort, and Reaper respected that so completely he didn't even argue it. He took Torch, Brick, Wren, and Cass down. The excavation shaft was cold, Calder 9's geothermal was deep, and the upper crust ran cold, a dry, bone-cracking cold that got into the joints and made everything heavier. The shaft was machine-drilled, precise, with mounted lighting that was still running on the site's independent generator. They descended on the elevator cage, which was meant for 6 people with equipment, and was currently holding 5 people with a great deal of equipment, and the 700-meter descent took 4 minutes of silence, during which Reaper listened to the rock around them and thought about 7 chambers and 3 accounted for, and what 4 unaccounted for creatures that could kill Veil warriors in 4 seconds were doing in the dark below. The chamber was everything Haas had described and more. It was organic. The first impression was of a living thing, not a room, something grown rather than built, with walls that curved and bent in patterns that defied structural logic, but had an internal coherence that felt biological, purposeful. The hibernation structures were visible. 7 large alcoves in the walls, each one sized for the creatures above, sealed with a membrane material that had ruptured, torn from the inside. 4 of the alcoves were clearly empty. The membranes were old, torn, brittle, beginning to degrade. 3 alcoves were different. Cass crossed to them without being told, her scanner already running. Reaper watched her work. She moved through the chamber with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing in the way that very few people ever knew. Anything, not the performance of competence, but the genuine article, the product of 1,000 hours of work and thought, and the particular kind of love that scientists had for the unknown when it was treating them decently. These 3 haven't been opened, she said. The membranes are intact. They're in full hibernation status. She looked at her scanner. 3 creatures still inside, not awakened. The 4 that left, Brick said. These 3 stayed. The membranes are sealed with a chemical lock, Cass said. It's a biological mechanism. There's a specific molecular trigger that initiates the awakening sequence. When the excavation cracked the chamber, the external atmosphere provided enough of the trigger compound to start the process in the 4 that were closest to the breach. She turned around. Her eyes were bright. I can replicate it. You can what? Wren said. The trigger compound. It's not complex. My scanner can analyze it well enough to synthesize the basics. It's essentially a hibernation termination signal. If I can replicate it and release it in the upper levels, it'll wake up the 3 that are still dormant, Torch said flatly. No, it's a bidirectional compound. The same molecule that wakes them at low concentration sedates them at high concentration. It's a threshold mechanism. High enough saturation, it pushes them back into metabolic dormancy. She held up her scanner. I need 40 minutes and access to the chemistry lab on sub-level 1, which is where the 3 awake ones have been spending their time, Brick noted. Yes, Cass agreed. with the equanimity of someone who had considered this and was choosing to consider it a solvable problem rather than a reason to stop. Reaper looked at her for a long moment, looked at the chamber around them, ancient, organic, alien in the truest sense, the construction of minds that had worked out different solutions to the problems of space and time and biology, and had come to conclusions that nothing in the Conclave catalog had ever imagined. He thought about the 7 Veil warriors who hadn't come home. He thought about the 4 creatures loose above them in the facility, each one faster and stronger than any standard military engagement template was built for. He thought about the shear gate and what was on the other side of it, the populated systems, the transit hubs, the inhabited worlds of a galactic conclave that had, for 11 years, looked at humanity's physical parameters and found them substandard. "You're sure," he said, "about the chemistry?" "Yes. About synthesizing it fast enough with the equipment on sub-level 1 and the 3 of them in the room? Ask me in 40 minutes. "I'll ask you in 40 minutes, Reaper said. He turned to Torch. "We're going to need a distraction." Torch smiled. It was the specific smile of someone who had been waiting for that word. "How big?" "Big enough for 3 of them. Not so big it brings the building down on our sister." "The building isn't going anywhere," Torch said, and began pulling components from her kit with the focused happiness of a craftsperson given a project that interested them. What followed was the kind of operation that didn't look impressive from outside and was very impressive from inside. Torch and Brick went into the eastern corridors to make noise, not to engage, but to present a stimulus that the creatures would respond to draw them toward the eastern section while Reaper and Wren got cast to the chemistry lab and held the door. Smoke and Ghost had confirmed via channel that the survivors were in the gate hub. Wren had sent the gate encryption protocol over comms, and Telvasi had reported all 3 targets moving toward the eastern disturbance. That left one problem. The 4th creature was not accounted for. Ghost's sensors had tracked 3 in the eastern section, and 1 that had not been visible since the original contact report. Possibly in the lower storage, possibly in the maintenance conduit network, possibly somewhere else entirely. And the somewhere else entirely was the operative concern because the chemistry lab was on sub-level 1, and the chemistry lab had 4 entrance points, and Reaper had himself and Wren to cover them. He set up at the main entrance. Wren covered the secondary. Cass worked. She worked the way she always had, efficiently, precisely, without wasted motion, with the particular quality of concentration that required nothing from the outside world, because it was entirely self-contained. Reaper had watched her study through every crisis of their shared childhood, their father's illness, their mother's second deployment, the years when it was just the 2 of them, and whatever she could pull from the school database. She had always worked like this. Like the problem in front of her was the only problem that existed, and every resource she had was available to solve it. He guarded the door and watched his sister save everyone's lives with a scanner and a chemistry kit, and 40 years of evolution that had, apparently, included the capacity for this precise kind of focused brilliance. The 4th creature found them at minute 31. It didn't come through a door. It came through the ceiling, through a conduit access panel, which was consistent with what they'd seen in the corridor where the Veil team had been taken. It had learned from that encounter, or this was simply its preferred approach, or both. It dropped into the chemistry lab with a sound like controlled thunder, 6 limbs spreading into contact positions before it fully landed. Reaper was already turning. He didn't fire immediately. That was the choice that surprised even himself in the aftermath, the instinct that overrode the trigger reflex. He needed 3 more minutes. If he engaged, if the creature focused on him, he could buy 3 minutes. But only if he didn't kill it, because a dead one would bring the others. He stepped forward instead. He stepped toward the thing that had killed Veil warriors in the dark, and he put himself between it and Cass, and he looked it in whatever served as its eyes, and he did not raise his weapon. The creature stopped. This was not, apparently, information it had. A prey organism stepping toward it. Not fleeing, not attacking, not presenting submission signals. Something outside the taxonomy of responses it had developed. Something it didn't have a file for. It tilted its head. Reaper held its attention with everything he had. Posture, stillness, the deliberate management of his own fear into something that presented as neither aggression nor submission, but as a third category the creature's instincts did not know how to label. He was an unknown, and unknowns, he was betting, were paused for. 2 minutes, Cass said behind him very quietly. He nodded very slightly. The The creature's secondary appendages, the curved blade-like ones, rose, slowly, measuring. Reaper did not move. Wren made a very small sound at the secondary entrance. Reaper didn't look. He kept his eyes on the creature. "Reaper," Wren said. "There's a second one." Of course there was. How far? Corner of my eye. Entrance 3, not moving yet. 2 creatures, watching, filing information. The way they'd filed information on the Veil team. And the Veil team had provided the information and been destroyed by it. "Cass," Reaper said, 1 minute. 1 minute. He had been in situations that lasted subjective lifetimes in objective seconds. He had been in situations where 1 minute was entirely survivable and had come out the other side in good shape. But this was new calibration, not adrenaline management, not tactical calculation, but something deeper and stranger, something that was about being looked at by 2 organisms that could process every observable fact about him and come to a conclusion, and the conclusion being that the conclusion would be wrong. Because they were building a model of him from observable data. They were very good at it. They had built accurate models of 7 Veil warriors and been right about all 7. They were building a model of him right now, and the model was going to be incomplete, because what they could see, the weapon, the posture, the biological signs of a stressed mammalian nervous system, did not include the variable that Reaper himself did not entirely understand but had spent his whole career learning to trust. The variable that was his sister 1 meter behind him, working as fast and precisely as she had ever worked in her life. The variable that was his team dispersed through this facility, each one doing their specific piece of the problem with everything they had. The variable that was the 19-year-old kid with a wrapped arm holding rear guard for 7 injured people who were going to make it home because someone had decided they were going to make it home. The variable, in other words, of what humans did for each other, not for glory, not for species pride, not for the satisfaction of proving something to a galactic conclave that had looked at their physical parameters and found them wanting. For this, 7 researchers in a blast-shielded room, a sister's face focused, a kid's breathing steadied, a team that was, right now, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. "Done," Cass said. She held up a sealed environmental dispersal unit, a standard lab item, used for atmospheric sampling. She had loaded it with what his scanner confirmed was a high-concentration synthesis of the hibernation trigger compound. "Release it?" she asked. "Do it." The dispersal unit cracked and the compound hit the air. The effect was not immediate. It was not dramatic. It was in fact almost anticlimactic, which was exactly what Reaper had been hoping for. The creature in the room, the one he had been staring down for the longest 2 minutes of his career, swayed slightly. Its appendages dropped by perhaps 10 degrees. Its sensory structures contracted in a way that suggested not pain but the specific softening of a system winding down. It made a sound, low, resonant, not threatening. Reaper backed away from it slowly. It did not follow. Its locomotion was already slowing, becoming thick and unprecise, the exquisite mechanical efficiency of its movement degrading into something ancient and heavy and tired. It lay down. At the other entrance, according to Wren's whispered report, the second one was doing the same. Torch reported, 40 seconds later, that both eastern targets were showing drastically reduced heat signatures and non-mobile status. "Sleeping," Cass said. She was watching her scanner with the expression she always had when data confirmed a theory, not triumph. Just the quiet satisfaction of something working as understood. The compound will maintain saturation in a closed environment for approximately 14 hours. After that is a problem for a bigger team, Reaper said, with better containment equipment. "Yes." She looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't either. "You stepped toward it," she said. "Seemed like the right call." "That was insane." "Probably." She held his gaze. Then she said, "I'm glad it worked." "Me too," he agreed, and picked up his weapon, and they went to get their people out. The Sheargate hub was intact. Ghost had the survivor stage and ready. Volna had turned out to be substantially more useful than her initial introduction had suggested, having organized the ambulatory survivors into an efficient exit queue and talked the 2 Veil researchers through a calming protocol that Telvasi watched with visible, complicated interest. Stitches had the critical patient stabilized, barely, but stably. Smoke was on the perimeter. He looked, Reaper thought, about 5 years older than he had at the start of the mission, and all 5 of those years were the good kind. "Gates encrypted and ready," Wren reported. "I can initiate transit on your mark." 4 targets down, compound saturation holding, no pursuit signatures, Ghost added. "We're clear." Reaper looked at Telvasi. She was standing near the gate controls looking at his team, all of them in sequence, the way you looked at something you were trying to accurately memorize, to replace a previous understanding with the correct one. "We should talk," she said, "when we're on the other side." "Sure," Reaper said. "The Conclave's assessment of human military capacity," Telvasi said carefully, "is going to require updating." "Ours usually do," Reaper agreed, without rancor. "I want to understand," she said. "The fear management, the way your team coordinated without the empathic field, the step toward the creature." She paused. "The way Dr. Marin worked under those conditions." "She's always worked like that," Reaper said. "That is not a species characteristic. That is individual." "All of it is individual," Reaper said. "That's kind of the thing with us. We don't share a field. We're all running separate processes. But we decide to line them up." Telvasi was quiet for a moment, by choice. "Yeah, every time. Every time." She looked at him with something that had no veil name for it but had human names, several of them, none entirely adequate. Respect was the nearest, but it wasn't precise. It was closer to the feeling of discovering that something you'd underestimated was, in fact, worth taking very seriously. "On your mark, Sergeant Major," Wren said. Reaper looked at his team, at the survivors, at the 19-year-old kid with the wrapped arm, at his sister, who was already thinking about the next problem, which was the 3 creatures still in hibernation in the chamber below that would need to be properly studied and properly secured, and which she was already cataloging in her head as the most significant xenobiological find in 3 decades. He looked at Telvasi, who was going to go back to the Conclave and file a report that was going to make a lot of very important beings very uncomfortable, and he thought that was probably good for everyone. "Mark," he said. The sheer gate opened and they went through. The Conclave Intelligence Subcommittee met in closed session 11 days after the Calder 9 incident. The session was supposed to last 2 hours. It lasted 9. Liaison Officer Telvasi testified for 3 of those hours, and by the end the committee had the particular expression, across all 12 species represented, of beings who had just discovered that a map they had trusted for a long time was wrong about something important. The map was their model of humanity. It had been built over 11 years of observation, physical parameters, combat records, strategic doctrines, average height, average mass, average reaction time. It had been built by people who understood data and did not entirely understand what data missed. What it missed was this: the particular human capacity to line up separate processes by choice every time, with no field to share and no collective consciousness to fall back on, in the dark and the cold and the fear, and keep doing it not because the biology demanded it, but because the person decided to, and to keep deciding in the moments when the biology was screaming, and the outcome was uncertain, and the creatures in the dark were very large and very fast and had never been in any catalog. The subcommittee's recommendation, filed 48 hours after the session, was a formal revision of Conclave human military classification from Category C, limited utility advisory capacity, to Category A, full integration, command eligible. It also recommended strongly that the Form 7 Gamma request threshold be reduced, that humans not be a last resort but a first option in situations involving unknown biological threats, extreme environmental conditions, or scenarios requiring adaptive tactical response under high ambiguity conditions. This recommendation passed with 11 of 12 votes. The dissenting vote was filed by the Keth delegation, whose reasons were stated as procedural, though the floor observers noted that the Keth senior representative had a particular expression throughout the proceedings that suggested the word procedural was doing a great deal of work. Reaper got a commendation. He filed it in the same folder as the previous 4, which he had never had printed or framed or displayed in any way, because he found that kind of thing faintly embarrassing. What he did do was take his team to the carrier mess deck, where the food was genuinely terrible and the coffee was arguably worse, and he sat there with them for 3 hours while they debriefed in the informal way, which is the real debrief, the one where you find out what actually happened and how everyone actually feels about it. Smoke had stopped trying to hide how he felt. He sat at the end of the table and ate an enormous amount of terrible food and said very little, and had the look of someone who had come through something and was taking their time figuring out what they were on the other side of. That was exactly right. Reaper watched him without watching him, which is a skill, and thought he was going to be fine. Torch had already sketched 3 improved explosive configurations based on what she'd learned about the creature's movement patterns. She showed them to Brick, who looked at them with the patient attention he gave to things Torch showed him, which was genuine interest masquerading as politeness. Ghost ate and said nothing and read a survey map of Calder-9's lower geological strata that he pulled from the mission file because his brain, when unoccupied, moved toward whatever problem was still open, and to Ghost there was always an open problem. Ren ran diagnostics on her equipment and ate with the other hand, and periodically made notes about the gate encryption protocol's structural weaknesses, which she was going to write up as a security recommendation for the Conclave infrastructure team, whether or not they'd asked for it. Stitches drank 2 cups of coffee and then fell asleep in her chair with the absolute completeness of a person whose body had been waiting for permission. And Brick put his jacket over her with the same matter-of-fact care he applied to everything. Cass sat next to Reaper and ate what she would later claim was the best terrible food she'd ever had in her life. And she had 14 pages of xenobiological notes on the chamber already drafted, and 2 of the people she'd been thinking about for 72 hours were going to need surgery, but were going to be fine. And one of them, Volna, had hugged her so hard in the gate hub that she'd felt ribs creaking, and that had been fine too. Tel Vassi's report is going to change things, Cass said. Probably. The Conclave classification, that's what they're saying. Does it matter to you, she asked, the official recognition? Reaper thought about it. Thought about the corridor and the creature and the particular quality of stillness he'd needed to maintain, and the calculation underneath it. Not about his own survival, but about what his sister needed from him in that moment, which was 3 minutes. And 3 minutes was what she got. Not much, he said. Why? Because we weren't there to prove anything, he said. We were there because 7 researchers were in trouble, and no one else was going. That's the whole reason. The classification is, he moved his hand in a gesture that encompassed the entire architecture of interstellar political opinion. That's their problem to sort out. Cass considered this. You know what the Conclave is going to do now, right? They're going to start sending humans into everything. Every bad room, every impossible situation. You're going to become the option they reach for when everything else has failed. Yeah, Reaper said. That's a lot of bad rooms. Good thing we like them. She looked at him. Then she laughed, actual laughter, not just relief but genuine amusement, the specific frequency of it that he'd known his whole life. And he found himself laughing too, quietly, in the way that people laughed when the thing that was funny was also real and the real part was survivable. You stepped toward it, she said again, still laughing. Seemed like the right call, he said again. It was so stupid, little bit I was watching, I know. My scanner confirmed the compound synthesis in real time. I was 94% confident it would work. 94%, he said. That's a very high confidence level for novel xenochemistry under field conditions. What happened to the other 6%? She smiled at him. The specific sideways smile that meant she was about to say something true. I figured that was your problem, she said. He lifted his terrible coffee. She lifted hers. They touched cups in the quiet, in the company of their sleeping and eating and calculating and quietly remarkable team. And outside the carrier's viewport, the stars were doing what stars did, which was nothing and everything, burning in their silence across distances that had, for a very long time, been considered too large for anything short of a Conclave warfleet to meaningfully cross. The Conclave would recalibrate its models. The Form 7 Gamma requests would come in, and there would be more bad rooms, and more corridors with the wrong kind of dark in them, and more creatures that had never been in any catalog, and more moments that required the specific choice. Not the biology's choice, not the collective's choice, the person's choice, to line up the processes and step forward. They would do it. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the kind of fear that made the breathing shallow and the hands want to shake, but with the particular quality that 7 Veil warriors had not been able to provide, not through any fault of their own, but because it was not a Veil characteristic. It was, as Tel Vassi would write in her report, a specifically human one, the capacity to look at the worst-case information available, accept it completely, and decide anyway, not despite the fear, not through the suppression of it, with it, alongside it, as a tool, not a weather pattern. On Calder-9's sublevel 4, in the ancient organic chamber, 4 creatures slept in the dry cold, their metabolisms wound down to near nothing, the hibernation compound doing its slow work in the sealed and filtered air. 3 more still and undisturbed in their membraned alcoves. The excavation shaft above them was sealed and monitored, and the data was already in transit to 4 separate xenobiology institutions across the conclave because Cass had been thorough in the 3 minutes she'd had. Sometime in the next 40 years, someone would study those creatures properly, would understand what they were, where they'd come from, what the chamber had been built for and by whom. It would be, Cass had said, one of the most significant discoveries in recorded xenoscience. A pre-conclave civilization that had solved problems of biology and time and hibernation that nothing in the current catalog had imagined. Remarkable, in other words. But that was their problem. Right now the carrier Meridian's hand was making transit toward the core, and on the mess deck a medic was sleeping in a borrowed jacket, and a specialist was reading geological surveys, and a PFC was eating his 4th bowl of terrible food with the focused commitment of a young man who had decided that being alive was something worth doing correctly, and Sergeant Major Cale Marin was drinking bad coffee with his sister while the stars burned outside. Not remarkable, not historic, not the story they'd be telling in conclave chambers for years. Just 8 humans who had gone into a bad room and done what they had decided to do. Just that, just enough. The debrief with Conclave Command took place aboard the Vale flagship Ureth's Resolve, which was roughly the size of a small moon and had been designed to make every non-Vale species feel specifically and deliberately small. The conference chamber was 3 levels of tiered seating, the conclave crest, 12 interlocking sigils, 1 per member species, rendered in actual rare metals on the back wall. There were 17 beings in the room when Reaper walked in, and every one of them was looking at him the way you looked at something you'd read about and were now revising your expectations of. He had cleaned up. He had filed his preliminary incident report. He had slept for 6 hours in a carrier bunk, which was the sleep of someone who had decided nothing was coming through that door tonight and had been right. He wore his service uniform, no decorations, just rank, and he walked to the witness position at the center of the chamber floor with the same unhurried quality that had, apparently, been one of the first things the conclave observers had noted in their original assessments of human military personnel. The way humans moved when they were not performing their capability, not broadcasting it, just carrying it like weight they'd gotten used to. The subcommittee chair was a luminari, one of the oldest member species, photosynthetic, with a body plan that was roughly columnar and a cognitive architecture that worked in something approaching continuous parallel processing. They were regarded as the wisest species in the conclave, which they accepted with the graciousness of beings who had been told this so often they'd stopped finding it interesting. Sergeant Major Marin, the chair said. Its translator rendered the sound in harmonics, multiple tones, simultaneously, which was the luminari equivalent of a measured senior register. We have read Liaison Officer Telvasi's preliminary report. We have reviewed your team's mission documentation. We would like to understand several specific decisions. I'll do my best, Reaper said. The creature in the chemistry laboratory, the chair said. You stepped toward it. Yes, you did not fire. No. Your firearm was functional. The creature was within effective range. You had used your weapon successfully against these organisms earlier in the mission. The chair's harmonics shifted into something that wasn't quite puzzlement but was adjacent to it. An ancient species trying to locate a human. Decision in its very extensive catalog of decision-making frameworks and not quite finding the shelf. Why did you not fire? Because I needed 3 minutes, and a dead target would have brought the others. You assessed that not firing would hold the organism in place for 3 minutes. I assessed that it would buy enough time for my sister to finish the synthesis. Whether it was 3 minutes or less or more, I didn't know. You accepted that uncertainty. I accepted it because the alternative was worse. If I engaged and brought the others, we had no containment options left. This way we had one option that had a chance of working. You describe it as a calculation, the luminari said, but the calculation required you to stand between a lethal organism and a family member for an indeterminate period of time. Yes, facing potential death, yes, for a 94% probability outcome. Dr. Marin's number, yes. You trusted her assessment. Reaper thought about that. It was a question that sounded simple and wasn't. I've trusted her assessment my whole life, he said. She's almost always right. When she's not, it's usually in a direction that's still interesting. The harmonics shifted again. The luminari chair was, Reaper had the impression, finding this response simultaneously logical and somehow larger than its logical components. The Veil method, it said, as liaison officer Telvasi documented in her supplementary filing, involves the elimination of the fear response. The combat reflex becomes the primary driver under threat conditions. This produces exceptional performance metrics against known threat categories. Yes, Reaper agreed. And when the threat category is unknown, the suppressed fear response cannot recalibrate, the chair finished. The warrior is optimized for a situation that no longer applies. 7 times. Silence in the chamber. 17 beings, most of them significantly larger and longer lived, and more heavily armed by their own biology than the humans standing on the floor, were quiet for a moment that had the quality of something being revised. The human fear response, said a different voice, a Keth, to Reaper's left, speaking through a translation collar, low and rasping, is not suppressed. No, it is managed, directed, converted to function. Ideally, yes. Takes practice. Your soldier, the Keth said. The translator rendered a direction, toward the mission record, toward smoke. The young one, his fear was visible throughout the operation. Yes, and he performed. He performed, Reaper confirmed. The Keth was quiet for a moment. Our species, it said, underwent significant biological modifications 600 years ago to reduce threat response cognition. We found it inefficient. Another pause. We have been reconsidering the timeline of that decision. Reaper kept his expression neutral. Sergeant Major. This was a different voice. Veil, from the upper tier. Not Telvasi, who was seated at the periphery. A Veil in full command carapace. Rank sigils indicating something very senior. In your assessment, is human military capability a transferable advantage? Can the management technique be trained into other species? Reaper thought about it. The technique, maybe. Parts of it. But I think the reason it works for us is the reason it can't be fully transferred. It's not a technique we developed on top of our biology. It grew with us. He paused. Earth is a genuinely hostile environment, not in the way that extreme condition worlds are hostile, not temperature or pressure or atmosphere. Hostile in the sense that everything on it was simultaneously prey and predator, and the species that survived long enough to develop tool use were the ones that figured out how to be afraid and functional at the same time. Because being paralyzed by fear meant getting eaten, and being fearless meant taking risks that got you killed. He looked at the room. 17 beings, 12 species, the assembled intelligence of a galactic conclave that had existed for longer than humanity had had language. We evolved in the narrow band between those two failure modes. Fear management isn't something we chose to do. It's something we were made to do by a planet that didn't give us the option of anything else. The Luminari chair made a sound that the translator didn't render. Directly in standard, it produced only a harmonic resonance that hit in the chest, old and resonant and somehow not unpleasant. Death World, said the Keth very quietly, not mockingly, like someone naming something they had just understood for the first time. Some people call it that, Reaper said. The formal proceedings concluded 2 hours later with a motion to revise the human military classification that passed in the ratio Telvasi had predicted. Reaper stayed long enough to sign the documentation, provided his team's after-action assessment in electronic form to the conclave record system, and then walked out of the flagship's conference level and into a corridor that was scaled for Veil and made him feel about 4 feet, tall in the way of all corridors scaled for Veil. Telvasi was waiting for him outside. She was not an administrative configuration, not the precise measured bearing of the official function. She was standing the way she stood when she thought no one was particularly observing her, which was to say she was standing like someone who had done hard things and carried them in her posture. And it was a more honest kind of standing. Your testimony will be referenced for years, she said. Seems like a lot of trouble over one mission. It was not one mission, Telvasi said. It was evidence. The Conclave has been building a model of humanity for 11 years, and that model was built on parameters, measurable parameters. Mass, sensory range, physical durability, documented combat record. She paused. What the model could not capture is what I watched in that facility, which was. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor was empty except for them, and the ship's environmental system made a low, constant sound that was not quite wind. The moment your soldier, the young one, steadied, she said. After you spoke to him, I have spent 40 years studying combat psychology, human and otherwise. I have never observed a technique that worked that quickly on a first engagement in an unknown threat environment. Another pause. What did you say to him? Reaper thought back. The storage room, the reddish light, smokes breathing a fraction too controlled. I told him his fear was accurate. Reaper said. Telvasi was silent for a moment that felt like recalibration. You validated it. It wasn't a technique. He was right to be scared. I told him so, and that helped. Being told you're seeing clearly helps when you're not sure if you're seeing clearly. Telvasi looked at him with the expression she'd had in the facility. Not quite puzzlement, not quite respect, but something that moved between them and had no clean veil name. The veil method, she said slowly, which I have practiced and taught for 40 years, proceeds from the premise that fear is noise, data that obscures signal. We suppress it to access the signal more clearly. I know. But if the fear is itself signal, if what you're afraid of is genuinely terrifying, then the fear is information. Suppressing it is suppressing data. Reaper shifted his weight. Your team in that facility, they weren't afraid and then ran. They ran because their suppression failed. Whatever was in there was so outside the expected parameters that the suppression couldn't hold. And they didn't have any experience of what to do with the fear when it came through, because they'd been trained to eliminate it, not use it. Silence. I am going to have to revise a great deal of my training materials, Telvasi said eventually. You don't have to. I find, she said carefully, that I want to. Reaper nodded. Your sister, Telvasi said. She has filed a research proposal. Already. The Calder 9 organisms. She proposes a proper containment study with a mixed species xenobiology team. She wants the Luminary Convergence Archive opened for comparative analysis against pre-conclave biological records. Telvasi paused. She also wants to return to the site. Reaper said nothing, which was a specific kind of communication. The subcommittee has provisionally approved the research program, Telvasi continued, under the condition that adequate security is provided. She looked at him. She requested you specifically. Of course she did, Reaper said. Will you go? He thought about the ancient chamber, the organic walls, the hibernation structures that had solved with grown biology rather than engineered metal, the problem of indefinite sleep through deep time. The three creatures still sealed in their alcoves, breathing at a rate so low it was barely registering on the sensors, waiting in the dark with no sense of urgency at all. Yeah, he said. We'll go. There was a moment. The corridor, the ship's low environmental hum, a 9-foot veil administrator who had filed 4 missions worth of career, defining incident reports in 2 days and was now, Reaper had the impression, standing at the beginning of a somewhat different professional direction. One more question, Telvasi said. Go ahead. In the chamber, when you stepped toward the creature. She paused. Were you afraid? Reaper looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. And you stepped forward anyway. The alternative was worse. She held his gaze. Something passed through her expression that had no translation. Something old and personal and professional and newly revised all at once. Humans, she said very quietly, not mockingly, not the dismissive use, the Conclave's Category C assessment, the 11 years of measured parameters that had missed what the parameters were measuring. Something else. The word as it would sound if you were saying it for the first time and meant it as a discovery. Yeah, Reaper agreed and walked back to his team. On Caldar 9, in the dark 800 meters below the surface, 3 creatures slept through the artificial chemical night of Cass's synthesis, their metabolisms wound to near stillness. The hibernation membranes in their alcoves were intact. The dig site had been sealed, the shaft locked, the monitoring equipment running on a 12-month power cell that would transmit to 4 different receivers if anything changed. In the 4 empty alcoves, the torn membranes were already beginning to degrade at the edges, a slow biological dissolution that would, in a century or so, leave no trace that anything had ever been sealed there. The chamber itself was ancient enough that it had predated every current member of the Conclave, predated the Luminary Convergence, and the Keth expansion, and the Veil unification. Whatever had built it had worked out problems that the galaxy's current civilization had not yet reached, and had left those solutions sealed in rock and organic chemistry, and the patient arithmetic of deep time. The instruments registered no movement. The compound concentrations held. The remaining 3 organisms breathed their near-nothing breaths in the silence. Outside, the stars were doing what stars did. Eventually, someone would come back with better equipment, better data, better questions. Eventually, the research would yield something that changed the understanding of what had come before, of what the galaxy's long history contained that hadn't yet been found or named or cataloged. Cass was already drafting the grant application in her head, which Reaper knew because she'd been talking to herself in the bunk above him on the carrier for 2 nights, just below the threshold of audibility, running the methodology in real time the way she always did. It would be important work. It would take years. It would change things. But that was the future's problem to hold. Right now, the Meridian's hand made its transit, and in its mess deck, a medic slept in a borrowed jacket, and a signal specialist cataloged the gaps in gate security protocols, and a young soldier ate his 5th bowl of terrible food with the committed intensity of a person who had decided that being alive was a project worth undertaking seriously, and 2 siblings who had grown up reading each other's silences sat in the easy company of people who have come through something together and know what it cost and know what it was worth. The conclave would file its revised classification. The Form 7 Gamma request threshold would drop. More calls would come, more bad rooms, more unknown corridors, more situations that required the specific narrow band between fearless and paralyzed. The evolutionary product of a planet that had trained its dominant species in the only school that was ever truly rigorous. Survive or don't, and figure out why either way. They would answer the calls. Not all of them would go well. Not all of them would come home. That was a fact of the work, not a caveat to it. And the people who did this work knew the difference between acknowledging a fact and being defeated by it. What would persist? What would be written into the conclave records and referenced in the testimonies of xenomilitary historians for generations was not the classification revision or the mission statistics or even Tel Vasi's landmark report on human combat psychology. It was something smaller and harder to quantify. The sensor record from the chemistry lab showed it. If you knew where to look, a human soldier with a functional weapon choosing not to fire, stepping toward a 6-limbed predator from a pre-conclave civilization, holding its attention with nothing but stillness and the management of his own fear, buying time for someone he trusted with everything he had. Not a warrior suppressing fear to achieve optimal function, not a being executing a programmed response, a person making a choice in the specific human way, with full knowledge of the cost, in the presence of the fear, with the particular stubbornness of a species that had been told for 11 years it was Category C, and had simply, quietly, continued to be what it was. That was the whole story. That was enough. What the conclave records never quite captured, what the mission documentation filed under Incident Report Call 9, UNDF classification, resolved could not hold, was the texture of the 36 hours between the mission's end and the formal debrief. The part that was not reportable because it was not operational. The part that was, in certain senses, the actual thing. It was Smoke teaching Ghost a card game he'd learned from his grandmother, a game that required no technology and could be played with any available flat surface, and a deck you could make from torn paper if you needed to. They played it in the carrier corridor outside the medical bay, while Stitches monitored the 2 critical condition survivors, and the game made enough noise to attract Torch, who sat down with the immediate authority of someone who intended to win and needed about 40 minutes to figure out the rules well enough to do it. It was Brick, during the 3rd hour of the transit, dismantling his heavy weapon on the mess deck table, with the careful, unhurried focus of a person who had done this 1,000 times and found it. Meditative, each component cleaned and checked and set aside in the specific order that meant he knew where everything was and could reassemble, blindfolded if the situation ever required it, which it had twice. It was Wren, in the ship's small technical bay, adapting the gate encryption protocol she'd written into a formal security advisory document that she then sent to the Conclave Infrastructure Team's public submission address without telling anyone, because she had found a genuine vulnerability, and it needed to be closed, and she was not the kind of person who waited for someone to ask her to do the right thing. It was Cass at 0200, standing at the viewport in the carrier's observation alcove, a narrow, utilitarian space with a transparent composite panel looking out at the transit stream, with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, watching the light do what light did at transit velocity, and thinking about a chamber 800 meters underground that was older than the conclave and smelled like the long patience of things that had decided to wait. Reaper found her there. He didn't say anything. He had a cup of the terrible coffee, and he stood next to her and looked at the same viewport, and they were quiet together in the way that people were quiet when they'd been speaking the same language their whole lives and didn't need to use words for it. "You know what I kept thinking about?" Cass said eventually. "Tell me." "When I was in the lab, working on the synthesis, with the creature standing 3 meters behind me," she looked at the viewport. I kept thinking about Dad's workshop when I was doing the regional science fair project. Remember? The cell membrane permeability model, he remembered. She had been 14. The workshop had smelled like solder and machine oil. Their father had sat in the corner with his coffee and let her work without interrupting, which had been his particular gift, the ability to be present without becoming a variable. You were there for 6 hours straight, Reaper said. 7. I didn't notice. She turned the cold cup in her hands. That's what it felt like. I was just working. The creature was a fact I'd accounted for. The time constraint was a parameter I'd built the synthesis around. It was just the problem. She paused. I wasn't brave. I want you to know that. I wasn't not scared. I was just more interested in the problem than I was scared of the thing behind me. That's a definition of brave, Reaper said. It's a definition of distracted. Maybe those are the same, she considered it. Maybe. A pause. You weren't distracted. You were standing there with nothing to do but hold its attention. I had plenty to do, he said. Managing what was going on in my own nervous system took most of my available processing. She smiled at that, the sideways one. Did it work? We're having this conversation, so. The transit stream moved outside the viewport, the light bending in the particular way that was either beautiful or unsettling depending on your frame of mind. And Reaper had spent enough time in transit that it had long since moved from unsettling to something that was almost companionable. The universe, showing you one of the stranger things it could do with physics when it had enough energy to play with. Telvasi asked me about the synthesis method, Cass said. She wants to know if it's applicable to other unknown biological threat organisms, as a standard containment protocol. What did you tell her? That every organism is different and it would take species-specific research to develop analogous compounds, but that the general methodology, identify the metabolic trigger, assess the concentration threshold, synthesize under field conditions, is in principle applicable given adequate equipment and time. She's going to want you on a consultation panel. She already filed the request. Cass looked at her cold tea, decided it was still technically tea, drank some. There's a conclave xenobiology working group on non-catalogued organisms. They've apparently had a backlog since the third periphery expansion opened up a lot of previously unsurveyed systems. She paused. They've been underfunded because the conclave's threat assessment models didn't prioritize unknown biologicals as a Category A concern. Let me guess, Reaper said. As of approximately 48 hours ago, that classification is under review. She looked at him. You know what that means. More missions, more research, more field deployments, more of whatever Calder 9 was, except with better equipment and preparation, which means they won't be as bad. But there will be more of them, and they'll be asking for mixed teams, Reaper said. Human and conclave species together. Is that all right? He thought about Telvasi moving through the corridors, adapting her formation, mirroring the human team's approach. He thought about the 2 surviving Veil researchers that Telvasi had found alive in the blast-shielded room, and the expression on her face when she'd confirmed their biometrics, the specific relief of someone who had expected the worst and been given something else, something to carry forward rather than just through. It's more than all right, he said, because that was the thing the parameters missed. Not that humans were better, not that the conclave species were inadequate, not the triumph and humiliation narrative that some people would try to make of the Calder 9 incident in the years that followed. Not the us and them of it. The thing the parameters missed was what happened when different ways of processing the same impossible situation were in the same corridor together. Telvasi learning to hold fear as data rather than noise. Volna organizing the survivors with the practical efficiency of someone who had decided that panic was a resource cost she couldn't afford. The 2 surviving Veil researchers who had, in the blast-shielded room, watched the human researchers and picked up something from them that their warrior training had not included. The specific quality of endurance that was not suppression and not courage exactly, but the decision to continue. In the presence of both the fear and the not knowing. Something had transferred in that room that wasn't a technique. Something had moved between species in a sealed space under pressure. The way things always moved between people under pressure, the way it had always worked. Not through broadcasts or fields or biological link, but through presence and example, and the observation of what another being chose to do when the situation did not require choosing. That was not in the conclave's model, it was now. The transit stream shifted. The viewport showed the first suggestion of deceleration. the light beginning to behave the way it behaved when real space was near, the geometry settling back toward the familiar. They were 2 hours from the core relay station. 6 hours after that, the carrier would dock. The survivors would transfer to the medical complex at Conclave Station 7. The team would file their formal after-actions. Telvasi would deliver her revised report to 3 separate subcommittees, and the long bureaucratic process of updating 11 years of incorrect assumptions about humanity would begin, which was the kind of work that took patience and precision and would not look like anything until it was done. Cass finished her tea. Reaper finished his terrible coffee. They stood at the viewport for a while longer without saying anything, because they had been doing this, standing at the edges of things together, looking at what was out there. Since they were small, in a house that smelled like machine oil and their mother's cooking, learning the particular human posture of looking at the unknown and deciding it was worth approaching. "Hey," Cass said, 94%. "Yeah, I was actually closer to 97, she said very casually. "I rounded down because I didn't want you to feel like you were taking a sure thing." Reaper looked at her. "You wanted me worried enough to be careful," he said. "I wanted you scared enough to be sharp." She looked at the viewport with the perfectly composed expression of someone who had absolutely no regrets about this. It worked, didn't it? He thought about stepping toward the creature. The stillness. The management of the nervous system in real time. Everything tuned to the task because the task was the only thing. "Yeah," he said. Outside, the universe continued to be what it was. Vast and indifferent and full of sealed chambers that had not yet been opened. Full of organisms that had never been catalogued. Full of corridors with the wrong kind of dark and stars that burned without consideration for anything beneath them. Full of questions that didn't have answers yet, and problems that hadn't been solved, and things that were genuinely terrifying, if you looked at them with honest eyes. And full, too, of the specific narrow band between fearless and paralyzed. The old evolutionary product of a hostile world, refined over 100,000 years of figuring out what to do when the thing you were afraid of was real. Full of people who had learned, one way or another, to step forward anyway. That was always going to be enough.